All right, welcome back to the channel. It's the end of 2020. This is the date of today is December 26th. I think there's only one major fight card before the end of the year, so the end of the decade. So I think this is a reasonable conversation to have. Floyd Mayweather Jr. or Manny Pacquiao? Who is the fighter of the decade? This is ridiculous. But let's talk about it because the whole conversation demonstrates something that I've been talking about with Deontay Wilder and Anthony Joshua, where the treatment of Deontay Wilder versus the treatment of a Tyson Fury, a treatment of Anthony Joshua, you can see that is just a microcosm of what you see occur in boxing quite often, where the obvious is rejected. Let's talk about that in this. All right, welcome back to the channel, subscribers. If you are not subscribed, please subscribe, hit the bell icon so you can be notified of when we release more videos. Also, man, make sure you check out the Patreon page. We got some new stuff coming up there. Actually, in 2020, we're really going to be upping the quality of what we do over there on Patreon. And thank you so much, everybody that joins the channel right there. And come by OG Boxing Talk Sundays, 8 a.m. Central Standard Time with myself, Blood, KQKC, Trap House, and my man Curtis Anderson, one of the best boxing historians out there. So let's get into this, man. All right, so we're ending the year, the decade from 2010 through 2020. Okay, so reasonably, not only are we starting talking about who the fighter of the year is and what the round of the year is and what the, who the promoter of the year is, all that stuff, right? Not going to talk about that, but you'll start hearing conversations about that. If you wanted to hear a great awards program, go check out my man D-Style Boxing, who does the D-Style Awards on YouTube. Excellent channel. He does his awards, and hey, I give my 2 cents on it, but I'll ride with him. This one I'm going to talk about is this fighter of the century thing. And in what you see in this conversation that's taking place. And I'm going to compare that to what you see with Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury, for example, right? Look. This is the answer to the question, or we're going to talk about this question, who is the fighter of the decade? Is it Manny Pacquiao? Is it Canelo Alvarez? Is it Floyd Mayweather Jr.? Who is it? And you have people with straight faces that will say Manny Pacquiao. A couple might say Canelo Alvarez. I've not heard Andre Ward or Deontay Wilder mentioned at all. Okay? Not mentioned at all. So let's stick for the most part. And there is an argument for Deontay Wilder. As brainwashed as some of y'all might be, I can make a good one for Deontay Wilder and what he's accomplished since 2010 to 2020, which include 23 knockouts and 25 fights. And a 10-fight defensive streak of the heavyweight championship of the world and holding it for half of that decade with almost all knockouts. But let's stick to these guys. There's nobody to put Canelo Alvarez over Floyd Mayweather Jr. when Floyd Mayweather Jr. beat him is ridiculous. When Canelo Alvarez has had a draw and many people thought he lost, I don't care if people thought he lost really, because it really came out as a draw. It is a draw. He had a draw against Gennady Golovkin and a very questionable win against Israel Andy Lara and a questionable win against Gennady Golovkin and not fighting. Canelo Alvarez is ridiculous for fighter of the decade, right? But I don't even have to, I can give him all of that credit and still tell you that that is Floyd Mayweather Jr. Floyd Mayweather Jr. from 2010 to 2020 is been undefeated. He beat Manuel Marquez, who beat Manny Pacquiao. Beat him easy against a guy that Manny Pacquiao went tooth to nail with for 4 fights went 2-1-1 with and wound up the last time they were there in the ring asleep, dead flat on his face. Floyd Mayweather Jr. beat him very, very easily. Floyd Mayweather Jr. was literally the biggest name in boxing from 2000, from the pretty much 2000 after the Oscar De La Hoya fight till today. But yet some people can find a way to try to justify putting a guy ahead of him that he beat and that he beat easily. And a guy that got knocked out by another guy that Floyd Mayweather Jr. beat easily. Now, that's not to say that Manny Pacquiao is not a Hall of Fame fighter, that he cannot be considered an all-time great fighter, right? It's not to say those things, that he is not somebody that has accomplished a lot in his career. Same thing for Canelo Alvarez, except for the computerall thing, right? But it's just so overwhelmingly all of the stats, all of the numbers, all of the things that we saw and experienced from 2000, not just from 2010 to 2017, when he basically the last time that he had an official fight, or 2015 when he had that Andre Berto fight, right? It's not just that, but it's from 2000 on. It's from the time that he fought Gennaro Hernandez and Diego Corrales and Jose Luis Castillo. It's back from then. Floyd Mayweather Jr. is not just a fighter of this decade. Floyd Mayweather Jr. is clearly the fighter of this century so far. And there shouldn't even be a doubt. But why is there a doubt? The same reason that there's a doubt, and there was conversations when he was fighting, and people were trying to manufacture reasons and ways to put Manny Pacquiao above him in a pound-for-pound fight, a competition when Manny Pacquiao was pretty much just beating guys that Floyd Mayweather Jr. had already beaten. He'd already beaten the guys. But, hey, man, it doesn't matter to a lot of these guys because they vote, they make up their mind about what they want to be the case, and then they build their argument and they structure their argument around what their true desire is. The reason that these guys don't vote, I believe, the reason that these guys don't want to vote for Floyd Mayweather Jr. to be fighter of the decade is because they don't want Floyd Mayweather Jr. to be fighter of the decade. And this logic that I'm talking about was so clearly demonstrated by a comment that Tony Bellew said about Deontay Wilder. Now, look at Deontay Wilder and all these conversations about heavyweights and how many things that they have to point to and ways that they can come up with telling you guys that have never defended a championship fight, not one time, in Tyson Fury, and who has not who's not beaten a top heavyweight in 5 years, is somehow the number one heavyweight in the world, right? Or overlook the fact that Anthony Joshua just got knocked out the fight before last, but want to start talking about how much money he made and how big the crowds are that he has. Trying to look for any old type of reason not to give Deontay Wilder that credit that Deontay Wilder has earned, because they don't want to. So they will find any type of way to go about it. And what Tony Bellew said was, look, I have Tyson Fury as my number one guy right now. This was after Anthony Joshua got beat up by Andy Ruiz, because it would just be a shame if Deontay Wilder was. That was his logic. I have Tyson Fury as the number one guy because it would just be terrible if Deontay Wilder was. So he said the reason he put Tyson Fury and think Tyson Fury is the top heavyweight is because he doesn't want Deontay Wilder to be, because he doesn't like him, period. And he doesn't like him for one reason or doesn't like him for another reason, whatever it is, they don't like him. And they're not the guy that the media guys are pushing to be that, right? So you have Floyd Mayweather Jr., who's not part of the top ranked stable when he did all of this. He was not part of the Matchroom stable. He was an independent fighter who did it his own way, that proved what he was about on his own terms consistently and repeatably, and wound up being one of the most successful boxers in the history of the game. But yet, a guy that he beats convincingly, easy money beat, and beat easily, a guy that knocked that guy out. Somehow he doesn't quite do enough to live up to Manny Pacquiao, who has been knocked out 3 times in his career, who lost to Eric Morales, who lost to Jeff Horn, who lost to Jose Luis, who lost to Juan Manuel Marquez, who lost to Tim Bradley. Somehow, the other things that Manny Pacquiao have done so much that he outstrips a guy that went 50-0, right? Went 50-0, and beat him. But, it just, that shows you what you're up against. And tell you that's one of the things and why the reasons that I talk about the media so much. These guys, either they just don't know what they're looking at, or they're making it up because they want people, because they need access to certain people. This is the same boxing writers, like the Boxing Writers Association of America, somehow, and I don't believe that these guys just don't know what's going on, right? In 2017, the Boxing Writers Association of America gave the Fighter of the Year to Vasily Lomachenko over Terrence Crawford. Terrence Crawford, during that year, was the first guy to unify the division since Bernard Hopkins had fought Jermaine Taylor like 10 years before. Lomachenko, because they were promoting Lomachenko, in my mind, had fought one guy in his own weight class. Jason Sosa, one guy. He fought three people. Miguel Mariaga, who moved up in weight and was coming off of a loss. Guillermo Rigondeaux, who moved up 2 weight classes and had fought 2 rounds in a year, and Jason Sosa. And they gave him, the Boxing Writers Association of America gave him Fighter of the Year over a guy that unified and was the only guy in boxing that could say he held all 4 belts, because they didn't like his level of competition. But yet they liked the level of competition of Miguel Mariaga and Jason Sosa. Dog, it's just ridiculous. So don't be surprised if you see people giving Fighter of the Decade to Manny Pacquiao, just like you have Max Kellerman saying he doesn't care what he sees with his eyes and what actually happens in the ring. Nobody can tell him that Floyd Mayweather Jr. is better than Manny Pacquiao. Clearly. And nobody can tell me that my wife is not the most beautiful woman to ever walk the face of the earth and period ever in billions of years of creation, right? You know why? Because that's what I feel. And that's my opinion. Okay. Now, forget the fact that more than likely, that's not true. Okay. It might not be true. Very hard to prove. But I'm going to be, because it's that way, because that's what I want to be the case, because that's what I want to have happen and I want to say. And that's the only reason you would have Manny Pacquiao win Fighter of the Decade over Floyd Mayweather Jr. or Canelo Alvarez over Floyd Mayweather or Deontay Wilder or any other fighter over Floyd Mayweather Jr. You'd want that to be the case just because you don't like the guy, period. That's it. That's the only rationale for it. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, I'm out. Peace.